Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going deep into instructional audits in education. You sent over some fascinating stuff on how the Centennial School District, CSD we'll call it, used them to improve their schools. Now, you might be thinking instructional audits, spreadsheets, and checklists, but hold on. It's way more dynamic. Think of it as a health checkup, but for a whole school district's teaching and learning.
What's fascinating is they're not about pointing fingers or anything. It's more about analyzing what's working, what needs attention, and how to create a truly effective learning environment.
Okay, so let's unpack this. You provided excerpts from a presentation by CSD Superintendent Dr. Dana T. Bedden. Before we dive into CSD's experience, can you give us a quick rundown of what an instructional audit actually is?
An instructional audit is a systematic review of everything involved in teaching and learning at a school or district level. It looks at how the curriculum aligns with state standards, the effectiveness of teaching methods, and even how resources are being used.
So it's like taking stock of the entire educational ecosystem. Now, you mentioned CSD started with curriculum reviews.
Yeah, back in May 2022, they did a major review of their math and reading programs. This led to a curriculum studies capstone report. Think of it as a detailed X-ray of their curriculum, examining how well it matched up with academic benchmarks and how effectively it was being taught.
So this wasn't just a surface-level glance. They were really digging deep. Why did CSD embark on this journey in the first place? What were the driving forces?
There were several key factors. They wanted to ensure their teaching materials were aligned with state standards, something that's, crucial for student success on standardized tests and beyond. Additionally, they were looking to improve teaching strategies and close those persistent achievement gaps that we often see between different groups of students.
Of course, staying compliant with the ever-changing world of educational regulations probably had something to do with it as well, right?
Absolutely. And let's not forget about feedback from the community. Parents, teachers, and other stakeholders all play a vital role in shaping educational practices. Their input was a big part of the decision to conduct these audits.
It sounds like they were aiming for a 360-degree view of their strengths and areas for improvement. But did these audits actually work? What kind of impact did they have on CSD?
Based on what Dr. Bedden presented, the outcomes were positive. They were able to refine their teaching strategies, ensure the curriculum was cohesive and aligned, and importantly, they saw positive changes in student outcomes. It really does seem like they moved the needle.
That's fantastic to hear. But I imagine it wasn't all smooth sailing. Change can be challenging, especially in a large organization like a school district. What were some of the hurdles CSD faced along the way?
One of the biggest challenges was finding that balance between carrying out a thorough audit with finite resources. They had to be strategic about where to focus their energy and resources.
Makes sense. You can't tackle everything at once. Did they have any other obstacles to overcome?
Implementing these changes without creating a blame culture was another hurdle. No one wants to feel like they're being penalized for past practices, right? They had to navigate that carefully. Another point of contention was deciding on the scope of the updates. Striking a balance between addressing critical areas and not overwhelming everyone with too much change at once was crucial.
That brings up an interesting point. Even if the changes are positive, too much at once can be overwhelming for everyone involved. It sounds like communication and staff morale were key considerations during this process.
They were. Dr. Bedden emphasized that staff buy-in is absolutely critical for success. You can have the most brilliant plan in the world, but if the people who are actually implementing it aren't on board, it simply won't work. So they focused on fostering a culture of open communication and collaboration, providing ample professional development opportunities to support their teachers through these changes.
This is where it gets really interesting for me. Dr. Bedden said something thought-provoking. Just because you communicate doesn't necessarily mean the message or information was received, retained, or understood. What do you think he meant by that?
It highlights a trap we often fall into. We assume that simply saying something means it's been heard and internalized, but that's not always the case. Communication is a two-way street. It's about sending the message, making sure it's received and understood, and then confirming that understanding. It's a continuous loop.
And this goes way beyond education, right?
Right.
This is relevant to all sorts of scenarios in our lives.
Absolutely. Misunderstandings and even conflicts often stem from communication breakdowns. It's not always about bad intentions. It's often a failure to effectively convey or receive a message.
So how did CSD ensure their message got through? How did they create that feedback loop and make sure everyone was on the same page?
That's a great question. And it leads us to the heart of some of their key strategies.
So before, we were talking about how CSD tackled the challenge of making sure communication was effective during their instructional audits. It's one thing to send a message, but how do you make sure it's really understood and acted on?
CSD recognized that even with the best intentions, messages can get lost in translation. They needed to create a culture where feedback was not only welcomed, but actively sought out.
So how did they make that happen? Did they have specific strategies for like two-way communication?
Absolutely. Think of it like this. They had the what figured out, curriculum alignment, updated teaching strategies, and so on. But they needed to focus on the how to get everyone on board and make those changes stick.
Okay, so walk us through the how. How did CSD ensure their teachers weren't just, passively receiving information, but actively participating in the process?
One of their core strategies was something Dr. Bedden called fidelity of implementation with flexibility. It sounds like a mouthful, but it's actually a pretty brilliant concept.
Break it down for us. What does fidelity of implementation with flexibility even mean?
Imagine you're baking a cake. You have a recipe. That's your framework, your guidelines. But you might adjust the amount of sugar or add a dash of cinnamon based on your taste. That's your flexibility.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this applies. So CSD provided clear guidelines, but they also gave teachers the freedom to adapt those guidelines to their individual classrooms.
Precisely. They wanted everyone to be on the same page about the goals, the overall direction, and the core strategies. That's the fidelity part. But they also recognized that classrooms are dynamic, and teachers need the space to adjust their approach based on their students' unique needs. That's where the flexibility comes in.
This concept seems incredibly relevant, even outside of education. It's about striking a balance between consistency and individual empowerment, right?
Absolutely. Think about any project you've worked on. You need a shared understanding of the goals and the process, but you also need to empower people to use their judgment and adapt to their specific circumstances.
Otherwise, you risk stifling creativity and innovation. So how did CSD actually put this into practice? How did they balance fidelity and flexibility on the ground?
They provided clear guidelines and expectations for implementing the new curricula and teaching strategies. They made sure everyone understood the why behind the changes and the specific outcomes they were aiming for, but they didn't micromanage every step.
So they set the guardrails, but didn't dictate every single move.
Right. They encouraged teachers to experiment within those guardrails, to try different approaches and find what worked best for their students and their teaching styles. They offered ongoing professional development and support, so teachers didn't feel like they were being thrown into the deep end.
It sounds like they were really striving to create a culture of trust and collaboration. They wanted teachers to feel supported, not just told what to do.
Exactly. And they also built in systems for feedback and reflection. They encouraged teachers to share their experiences, both successes and challenges, so they could learn from each other and continuously improve. Creating a space for open communication and continuous learning is so important, especially in a field like education where things are constantly evolving. It seems like CSD understood that change isn't a one-time event, but an ongoing process.
And that brings us back to Dr. Bedden's point about communication. It's not enough to just send a message. You need to make sure it's received, understood, and acted upon. You need to create a feedback loop, check for understanding, and be open to different perspectives.
Which is something we can all benefit from, no matter what field we're in. Whether we're leading a team, managing a project, or even just trying to improve our own work, understanding how to effectively communicate and foster collaboration is essential.
This brings up another challenge that CSD had to tackle: limited resources. School districts are often underfunded. So how did they manage to make these changes happen without breaking the bank?
That's a great point. Let's dive into how CSD managed resources and overcame financial limitations in the next part of our deep dive. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been unpacking CSD's approach to instructional audits. And before we touched on a challenge that everyone can relate to: limited resources. How did CSD manage to implement these changes without an unlimited budget?
Yeah, it's a common pain point, especially in education where resources are often stretched thin. But CSD tackled it strategically, taking Dr. Bedden's advice to heart. He emphasized prioritizing, being data-driven, and thinking outside the box.
So instead of trying to boil the ocean, they focused on what mattered most. Can you give us some concrete examples of how they put this into practice?
They started by pinpointing the areas that truly needed the most attention. Instead of spreading themselves thin, they used data from the audits and student performance to guide their decisions. They asked themselves, where can we make the biggest impact with the resources we have?
That makes a lot of sense. It's about being laser-focused and making every dollar count. What about thinking outside the box? Did they explore any creative solutions to stretch their resources further?
They did. Dr. Bedden suggested exploring partnerships with external organizations to bring in additional support and expertise. They also took a close look at the talent they already had within the district. Instead of always seeking outside consultants, they found ways to leverage the knowledge and skills of their existing staff.
So it was a combination of smart prioritization, data-driven decision-making, and leveraging both internal and external resources. Did Dr. Bedden offer any other practical tips for resource management?
He did. He highlighted the importance of phasing in the changes gradually. This prevented overwhelm, allowed for adjustments along the way, and also helped to spread the costs over time. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
That's a helpful analogy. You can't expect to overhaul an entire school district overnight. It's a process that requires careful planning and execution. This concept of fidelity of implementation with flexibility seems to come into play here as well, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It's not just about what you're implementing, but how you're doing it. CSD recognized that rolling out these changes would require a balance between maintaining consistency across the district while also giving schools and teachers the flexibility to adapt to their specific contexts.
So it's a dance between having a clear roadmap, but also allowing for detours along the way. It sounds like they embraced a growth mindset, acknowledging that there would be bumps in the road and adjustments would be needed.
And this connects back to what we were discussing earlier about communication. It's not enough to just tell people what to do. You need to create a culture where feedback is valued, where people feel empowered to speak up when something isn't working, and where there's room for continuous learning and improvement.
It's about building a system that's both structured and adaptable, one that can evolve as needs change and new challenges arise.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that the journey is just as important as the destination.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into instructional audits, what are the key takeaways for our listener? Even if they aren't in education, what lessons can they glean from CSD's experience?
I think there are some powerful lessons here that transcend any specific field. Firstly, the importance of evaluation and continuous improvement. Are you taking the time to step back and assess what's working and what's not in your own work or projects?
That's so crucial. It's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day and lose sight of the bigger picture. We can all benefit from a periodic checkup, whether it's a formal audit or simply a moment of reflection.
Secondly, remember the power of data-driven decision-making. Are you relying on gut feelings, or are you using data to inform your choices? CSD's experience shows us that data can be a powerful tool for identifying areas for improvement and making strategic decisions.
Data can help us see things we might otherwise miss, and it can provide a more objective perspective. And of course, we can't forget about the human element. CSD's success was largely due to their commitment to building a culture of collaboration and communication.
They understood that change is a team sport. It's not about dictating from on high, but about bringing people along on the journey, making them feel heard and valued, and empowering them to contribute their unique skills and perspectives.
Which brings us back to that brilliant concept of fidelity of implementation with flexibility.
Yeah.
It's a principle we can apply in all areas of our lives. Where do we need to be firm on principles and guidelines? And where do we need to give ourselves or others the space to adapt and innovate?
That's the million-dollar question, and there's no one-size-fits-all answer. It's about finding the right balance for each situation and being willing to adjust as we go.
As Dr. Bedden so aptly put it, just because you communicate doesn't necessarily mean the message or information was received, retained, or understood. Effective communication requires ongoing effort, a willingness to listen, and a commitment to ensuring that everyone is on the same page.
We hope this deep dive has provided you with some valuable insights and actionable takeaways. Whether you're leading a team, managing a project, or simply striving to improve your own work, remember the lessons we've gleaned from CSD's journey.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration of instructional audits. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into a fascinating topic. Until then, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep those conversations flowing.